We are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see them, are understood and valued by others.
I'm your host, Eileen Boris, and I'd like to welcome you to Political Forgiveness Voices of Peace, a podcast of hope where forgiveness and political forgiveness intersect to create a better world. My guest today is Tim Phillips. Tim is the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict, a nonprofit organization that works with leaders to address conflict and promote social change in the United States and abroad. Tim has led efforts to catalyze the peace and reconciliation processes in several nations, including Northern Ireland, El Salvador, and South Africa, and has advised the United Nations, the U.S. Department of State, and the Council of Europe. Recently, Tim has led efforts to explore the fields of neuroscience and social change in Beyond Conflict's Innovation Lab. Welcome, Tim.
Hello, Eileen. It's great to be with you today.
I know you're working with leaders who were dealing with the painful legacies of dictatorships, which threaten to undermine their emerging democracies. So I'm wondering, why were you curious about countries from post-communist Europe and how they dealt with the past?
When I was traveling through Central and Eastern Europe at the very beginning of the end of the Cold War and had a chance to meet dissidents from these newly emerging democracies who are now all of a sudden stepping in to run these governments. And they were getting a lot of support from the United States and Western Europe on how do you build democratic institutions? How do you hold free and fair elections? And how do you build market economies? And what I was curious about, I would ask them, how are you dealing with the legacy of the past? And this is before we even had fields of transitional justice, truth commissions, and so forth. It was more at a personal human level. How are you dealing as individuals and families and communities and nations with what it's like to live under that burden of repression for generations? What it does to people in terms of their capacity to be agents, to feel like they are citizens again, to feel like they have a certain degree of sovereignty, and to release that hold, that constant vigilance against a repressive state. What they said to me was, those are the questions we talk amongst ourselves about. How do we deal with this legacy? We have a lot of cynicism, even though we're excited about this change. How did it happen so quickly? Who were the collaborators? Was there conspiracies behind this? We had people, family members and friends who spied on each other. Who do we trust? We all had to fall in line and be a member of the party. And yet here we are now in these new democracies, but we don't really feel like we can step into them until we deal with this legacy. Can we trust them? That was an issue that really resonated for them and me. I had this basic idea. Wouldn't it be interesting to bring together these emerging leaders, and not just people running government, parliamentarians, ministers, new civil society leaders who are now stepping into these positions, with people who themselves struggle with these same challenges. And you would find them in places like Argentina, Chile, or Spain after Franco, or Germany at the end of the Second World War, where people were emerging from dictatorship or repression or military dictatorships in the case of Chile and Argentina, and stepping into these newly reestablished democracies. And they have struggled with this legacy while trying to build this, and that they, almost like a support group on wheels, had much to share. So that was the sort of genesis and thinking, and it just grew.
The last time we had a conversation was on forgiveness as a form of release. You were talking about Rolf Meyer, who was someone who was a beneficiary of the Apartheid. He's South African, and he became the government minister of defense in South Africa. And he mentioned to you about the importance of recognizing the trauma of the oppressor. Can you share a little bit about what he said?
Yeah, and so I've had the privilege of becoming a friend of Rolf for 3 decades now. And we spent a lot of time working in other countries or traveling in South Africa and elsewhere. And really, as he's reflecting back on his journey, many years ago, we were at an event to mark the first anniversary of Nelson Mandela's passing. And I was moderating a conversation with him and another South African who was from the ANC. And I said to Rolf, did you feel any anxiety, insecurity about the decision that you and de Klerk were making when you negotiated the end of apartheid and you signed the final agreements? And how did you feel afterwards? And he said to me, I was feeling anxiety, insecurity. There's a part of me thinking, am I doing the right thing for my people, my community, my nation? But I knew I was doing the right thing. But there were so many forces, political forces, economic forces, people close into the party, certain family members at a distance who were like, what's on the other side of this change? Not that they didn't want the change, but people feared what's on the other side of this change. Because we've lived 3 or 4 centuries where our community, or the white community, has had all the power and privilege. And he said, the moment we signed that agreement, I felt liberated. I felt completely liberated, and that there was a paradigm shift that had happened. I said, your own community, the Boer or Afrikaner community, went through a form of ethnic cleansing and genocide by the British, by whites in the early 20th century. 20,000 men, women, and children were killed. Did your community ever really confront that? And he paused and he said, if I think about this more, that if my community had an internal process of healing and truth telling, I'm not sure we would have set up apartheid. And I thought that was a really interesting insight. I talked to a colleague of mine who does a lot of work on trauma and mental health, said to me that in his own family story from Latin America, it's very difficult to acknowledge the trauma of your oppressor or those individuals who did horrible things to you for obvious reasons. But I think we can see, stripping us all away, we're humans. And not just as individuals, but as families and communities and nations that can act in very similar ways.
It's really interesting to me, and I'm sure you've experienced this as well, when you're getting groups together. Now I'm thinking Israelis and Palestinians, and the anger and the trauma and the hurt that both sides experience, and yet they cannot even acknowledge that the other side is experiencing these things too. And we've talked about victimization, there's almost a competition for it. But can you imagine what would happen if people could, for one moment, recognize and acknowledge that there's been oppression on both sides?
Desmond Tutu, this great figure of reconciliation and justice and democracy in South Africa and globally, chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I once heard him say, when somebody asked him about forgiveness, and in his great sense of humor, and he was very authentic in saying this, he said, this is very difficult. When my wife and I have a fight, sometimes I struggle to say I'm sorry. When we talk about forgiveness or political forgiveness, we think of it in these big, almost existential terms, particularly when we see what's going on around us and the work we do. But it's always important to bring it back to the lived human individual experience. These things are even difficult in our own families, no matter where we live, right? It's part of being human, which is why we started going to brain and behavioral science to understand this.
I know that we talked a little bit also about some of the stories that you've shared with me that have been really profound on forgiveness. There was, I think, one in Northern Ireland about you involved with a filmmaker. Do you remember that?
His name is Stephen Travers, and there's a Netflix film called The Miami Show Band Massacre. The thing about Northern Ireland, because it's so small, when people see 3,800 people were killed, if the same number of people were killed in the United States over 3 decades from political violence that were killed in Northern Ireland, it'd be close to 1 million Americans killed and 25 million wounded by political violence. Imagine that. And a colleague in Northern Ireland suggested I meet with Stephen Travers. The backstory on Stephen was he was Irish from the Republic of Ireland. He was not in politics. He didn't live in Northern Ireland. He became a key member of a leading show band in Ireland that was famous across Northern Ireland and Ireland. They would have their own songs. They do cover songs. In 1975, at the height of the Troubles, which is what they call the conflict, when so many people were being killed and bombings were happening almost every day, the band went up and played a couple of gigs in Northern Ireland. They often would cross the border. And show bands were not politicized. They were not targeted by any of the paramilitaries or political actors. It was a release for people. And Stephen said one night coming back from Northern Ireland, heading over the border back into the Republic of Ireland, they get pulled over by these uniformed civil guard called the Ulster Defense Regiment, just like the National Guard at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they thought, okay, they'll just recognize us and let us go. In this case, they didn't. They seemed to recognize us, but they didn't let us go. They asked us to step out of the vehicle. And it turns out they were one of the two Protestant loyalist paramilitary groups, which makes it more complicated, that the British security services helped set up this ambush.
Oh my goodness.
It's even more complicated, and it's still a legacy 3 decades later. And they moved the musicians off to the side of this Volkswagen bus to interrogate them. They were going to search the vehicle, but what was happening is there were two paramilitary men planting a bomb under the driver's seat, and they were going to drive over the border, and outside Newry, this massive explosion would take place. And what they were going to blame was that the Irish government wasn't providing security, that these people were working in cahoots with the IRA and wanted to have a big crackdown. And this had been 2 years or more in planning with elements of the British security services. Well, what happened was the bomb prematurely exploded, killed the two paramilitary men right away, blew everybody into the field or into a ditch. And the remaining paramilitary, with the British officer watching the whole thing, went and shot and killed all the band members. And Stephen was shot with a dumb bullet that broke into like 11 pieces, and he was left to die. And what ended up happening was he survived. He told me, and by the way, it was so interesting when I watched him be filmed for this. He described in absolutely intimate detail every minute of what happened. And one of the things I know from researchers with post-traumatic stress is that people can remember the details. That's how our brain navigates the experience. And here he is 3 decades later describing it as if it just happened. But he said that he came to a point to say, you know what? I decided early on to, he used the word reconcile, to forgive. And he said, I just didn't want this burden on me and my wife and my family. These guys were later caught. The ones who survived, they were in prison. Some of the leaders of the paramilitary group were in prison. And then as part of the peace process, they were released. But he said, I did it for me, and I did it for my colleagues. Now, fast forward, Netflix is doing this film. And as a good filmmaker, they want to see this sort of reconciliation. And so Stephen reached out to the leader of this paramilitary group to ask if they could be filmed. And he said, no. Why does he want to come and see us? Does he now want to prosecute us? Does he now want to hold us responsible for this? And my friend said, no, what he told me is he wants to shake your hand so that you can lift him off that field you left him on 3 decades ago. And the guy said, we haven't even told our grandchildren what we did in those days. I said, there was one other survivor. Did he feel the same way? He said, no, he couldn't forgive. He said, it's an individual choice, but it's powerful. And one of the things I keep going back to when I think about this issue is, what does it do for the person who was the victim? What is the release for them?
Forgiveness is a choice.
Right.
And there's an incredible misperception about forgiveness. A lot of people think if I forgive somebody, I'm letting them off the hook. But that's not what it's about. It's about the victim being able to let go of the emotional burden of what happened. And in Stephen's case, what he's basically saying is, I don't want to be a victim 2 times over. He decided he wanted to move on with his life. One way of doing that was to let go of that anger, hatred, fear, whatever he was feeling, so he could move on. That is the release. Forgiveness is based on skills, and we can all learn it. We don't have to go to a monastery. We don't have to have certain religious beliefs. Forgiveness is open to all. And when I do work in political forgiveness with groups, the first thing I do is some skill building so they can really appreciate the work of forgiveness in their own lives and the difficulty of forgiveness in their own lives. It is a complex process. It is a choice. And I always start from a very pragmatic perspective of it's going to help you let go of your pain and suffering. For those who work more deeply in it. And they come and say, Dear God, help me. I want to let go of this. And all of a sudden, they're freed. That to me is what grace is about. That something happened within ourselves that allowed us to finally let go of that pain and suffering. And when we can begin to appreciate that, we can begin to see what the other has gone through.
And the thing about forgiveness is I think it's a very different experience from the individual who suffered directly and survived, trying to get centered in themselves at that sort of bodily, psychological, somatic level, to calm down their central nervous system to make meaning of their lives again. They have to do what you're saying earlier. It's an emotional reappraisal. What's interesting, we do some work with Bessel van der Kolk and his wife through the Trauma Research Foundation, and he's been doing a lot of work with clinical trials on psychedelics that people have been through profound post-traumatic stress. And what's interesting about that research is that when they put people in an fMRI, this functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, while they're in a psychedelic journey, the default mode network of their brains goes offline and they see the brain much more active. What people describe going through the journey is almost a clinical review of the trauma they experienced.
Mhm.
They're reappraising it emotionally at a safe distance. Psychedelics, under certain conditions, I think, in not like a Molly rave, but psychedelics on a gummy, seem to be showing that allows an emotional reappraisal that sticks, that elements of our brain come online that detach from the emotional salience of that experience to view it. And there's a brilliant researcher who does work on forgiveness as a neuroscientist, said that those that have made a choice for one reason or another to forgive horrific things that have happened to them or their family, it literally can see a different neural signature. It releases the PTSD signature through that emotional reappraisal, and it reduces their post-traumatic stress.
That's pretty amazing. So, what can we take from that to help people be more ready to learn how to forgive?
My sense of this, which is at the core of our shared experience work, which the science reaffirms to a large extent, is that as humans, we need to feel understood as we see ourselves by others.
Right.
Now, objectively, you may look at somebody and say, that's not the reality. But subjectively, that's how they see it for a whole set of reasons. And so, what we now know more and more is that we have this psychological, biological necessity to feel understood and validated by others. And then when that begins to happen, when the others give a symbolic concession, like on the theme of sacred values, I recognize how important this is to you, how key this is to your sense of who you are, your ethics, your values, and the community you belong to, without necessarily agreeing that you support those particular values. It creates a cognitive shift. People are more willing to engage, right? And I think that's where forgiveness begins to fit in, is I want to release this, but I want to understand myself. I want to understand and make meaning of what's happened to me, that I've gone through this incredible experience, and I want to be human again, where I can have agency in my life and not constantly be bombarded by this traumatic experience.
And some of that sounds like giving people the space to share their stories in a safe container where they can express their grief, their anger, they can mourn their loss and feel heard, which in psychological terms also helps bring down the defenses of the other listening to that. And so what you're basically saying that this is really validated through neuroscience.
Yeah, it's validated in so many ways, right? I once had Jerry Adams from Northern Ireland come to a class at a university.
Mm.
Student raised her hand and said, how do you sit across the table and negotiate with somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have killed somebody very close to you? He paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. In that class, the retired neuroscientist, he was in his 70s, came up to me. He had been observing the different classes. And he said, I've heard now today humiliation, empathy, and fear. When I asked about the brain science, he's the first one who said to me, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see them, are understood and valued by others. Our brains evolved to be predictive and not reactive. They're anatomically more efficient being predictive. We are literally all here today as a species because we've learned to predict our social and physical environment. In this life experience, we're wired for survival. So how do we survive? By predicting our environment. Not only am I safe, but what groups do we belong to? Do we feel safe in this group? Who has my back? Where are their threats? And then along that tree of survival and stability and safety, before you get to something much more beautiful, we do horrific things to each other, or we have horrific experiences. And our ability to feel safe again, our ability to predict goes back to that, our ability to navigate this. And what the research in neuroscience shows, even separate from forgiveness, is that every thought we have is an electrical current in the brain, and every thought we have is stored.
And if you take a look at the forgiveness process and you take a look at how do we heal from PTSD, they run parallel.
Yeah, I really admire the work you're doing with trying to create this model of political forgiveness. And as you've said to me in the past, it's not a skill like how do you negotiate a peace agreement, right? How do you negotiate legal contract? There are emotions of loss and gain, and do I trust the people? But when it comes to forgiveness, it's usually associated with something profoundly harmful. I once taught a course at another university on revisiting the past, rethinking transitional justice and other mechanisms. It struck me, forgiveness is a personal choice. Understanding is a necessity.
That's interesting.
And the reason I said understanding, because we have this, and I use the word biological, not just psychological, it doesn't just sit in our head. We have this biological necessity to feel understood, as I mentioned, as we see ourselves. How do we understand the world around us? And one of the things I find as a non-scientist the last 15 years is the more we introduce some key concepts of how our brains work, everybody leans in. And it feels like I'm understanding myself better. And by understanding myself better, I begin to understand others because we're talking about the human brain. Too often, what we try to do is get people to understand themselves. Like, you need to understand your privilege. You need to understand your X, Y, and Z. And I flip it and say, let people begin to understand themselves in a much more accessible, almost neutral way. And by extension, help them see what it is to be human. I'll give you an example. We did a lot of work with Syrians who, I hate to use the word refugees because these are wonderful human beings and become friends, and who were forced to flee over the border into Jordan and the Zaatari refugee camp. And we were developing this tool to use insights from brain and behavioral science, basics of psychology, storytelling, meditation, breathing exercises to help them. And there'd be like a novella written with both the Syrian man and woman who fled, of what they were experiencing in a story of fleeing during the war. And then the next chapter would be, so here's what was happening in your brain. This is why this made you feel this way. And you would hear consistently from these people, they would first say, wait a minute, if other human beings had experienced what we experienced, they would respond the same way. They would really feel this incredible sense of release. They would think, wait a minute, it's not just us. And that's part of what happens with trauma, with humiliation, with this sort of profound emotional suffering. We tend to think it's about us. Why did they do it to me? And when you realize, in their case, that other people anywhere on planet Earth that experience what you experience would likely have similar responses, they feel an incredible sense of release. Wow. It's like, I understand not only something about me, but about what it is to be human. And that's why I think we have to have a focus on not forgiveness as a personal choice, but understanding, I think, is a kind of an obligation we have, not to discount and forget, but understand why we are as human beings in the world.
What you described on a biological basis is our interconnectedness. In the work of forgiveness, when you can get to an understanding, to releasing your own strong emotions, so you can get to the place of walking into somebody else's shoes, I think to add that piece of explaining and demonstrating through the stories that we've got the same brains, and this is what's going on, I think it's just another way of demonstrating how we're so connected.
I've come to realize over the last 15 years as a non-scientist working with this, that we need to be teaching children at a young age, not just how to write, how to do math, but learn about their brains. because we are burdened by this pedagogy from the Enlightenment that humans are fundamentally rational beings, and we know we're not. We know more than 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. So that automatically begs, well, we better understand how the human brain works. But even if you never finished high school and you're walking down the street and somebody does something really obnoxious to you, your immediate reaction is they made a conscious choice. And so by giving children this knowledge, they begin to question and say, oh, was that a conscious choice or not a conscious choice? Look at the world we're in now and the state we're in. Now, you're talking about forgiveness and trauma. I wrote a piece, which I ended up not publishing several years ago after the first election in 2016. I found it very difficult when I saw how some people rejoiced in the actions I thought were purely dehumanizing and harmful. And then one day I woke up and I thought, wow, I've spent the last 25 years working around the world, encouraging people to make peace with their enemies who in many cases did horrible things to each other. I realized I was at a safe emotional distance. I could come home. I have great empathy, but I was in the United States. Yeah, we had our problems, but we weren't doing that, right? And then I realized if they could do what was needed, then we can do what we need to do here. And in every case, it's not like we forgive people. I'll give you one example. Monica McWilliams, who founded the Women's Coalition with colleagues in Northern Ireland, said the first day they sat at the table, to her left was a representative of the loyalist paramilitary group that killed her boyfriend in college, tortured him. And then she looked around the table. There was one guy who had 8 bullet wounds in him. There were people in the room, not just their groups, who were responsible for killing people very close to them or trying to kill them. And she said, this is what we need to stop. That person became a very close friend of hers. Because of my work there, I got to know a lot of them. And one of them, David Irvine, who is an incredible man, he once said to me that when he was in prison with the other loyalist prisoners, he spent a decade there for terrorism. He and the other loyalists learned Irish so they can understand what the IRA prisoners were saying across the prison wall. Then they realized we had a lot more in common with them than we ever imagined. And he said, I also came to realize that in order to protect what was sacred to me as a member of the British culture and as a Protestant, I had to recognize what was sacred to others across that divide. And just like the sacredness that we all have these aspirations and identities that shape who we are. And that moments that I think for Monica and others where they realize, yeah, this war, this conflict has made us do horrible things to each other. And we can become friends and never forgive them for what their group did.
So you can become friends and not necessarily forgive.
Yeah.
That's interesting. You've had so much experience with leaders around the world, and you've seen so much and learned so much. What can you share about what's going on today in our country? Leaders here are being threatened, they're being intimidated. And as we began this conversation, started talking about some of these emerging leaders had to deal with those same kinds of issues to start building their democracies again.
The theme is forgiveness. The work I've done, forgiveness, tends to come to a point when you're in a process of engagement or ending a conflict or you've negotiated the end of apartheid. I think here at this moment, it has to be about clarity. And that clarity is what is at stake as Americans? No matter what your political belief, no matter who you supported, what is at stake in this country right now? And that's the ability to live with each other peacefully, with justice, with opportunity, all the things that we have talked about as Americans in a shared society. In Northern Ireland, a man named Seamus Mallon, who was one of the leaders of the SDLP, said around the signing of the peace agreement, I don't care what we call this country, as long as we each can call it home. I did a podcast a few months ago with Rolf Meyer, and he said, we all realized in that process, we all loved our country, South Africa. So we need to make this work. Be clear about what's at stake. A place where you could live in peace, where your children and grandchildren can grow and prosper, that we lived in a shared society with shared problems. People who are Americans of our diverse background are not going away. We can't hide our problems. We are mostly a nation of immigrants. We've done a lot of work on dehumanization. Pretty much every person in this country can look back in their own life or their parents or grandparents or great-grandparents' generation and see these experiences and stories of feeling dehumanized and demonized. And when you anchor it in your own lived experience, what that did to my family, I wouldn't want to do to another family. It's really painful as an American who has spent 35 years around the world doing this work to see what's happening here. Now, I can understand where, in the lens of brain and behavioral science, how fear is a force multiplier. So is courage. And I think we have to be clear that what's at risk is a democracy, a republic, a place living under the rule of law. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. We have to remind ourselves of those values and principles and build a center of stability as a nation. So what happened in South Africa is when Rolf and de Klerk were committed to building a new multiracial democracy anchored in the rule of law and a new constitution, Mandela and Cyril Ramaphosa and others were committed to the same process. They needed each other. They were under intense pressure from all sides, a lot of violence to get through it. In Northern Ireland, once like Sinn Féin, the IRA, were committed to ending the violence and building a politics of consent. You had David Trimble and the Unionists and other communities agreeing to that. They needed each other because there were people trying to undermine it. There was violence. The Omagh bombing happened after the Good Friday Agreement. I think 25, 30 people were killed, and they're still struggling.
My concern is, how can we have clarity when there's so much anger, there's so much grievance, there's so much fear, and really there's still so much healing. And I'm talking about our history and the healing from the Civil War. I think there's so much healing that still needs to happen before people might be able to get to the clarity that you're speaking about.
I had the chance to spend time with Andrew Young, the great Andy Young, who is Martin Luther King's right hand. He said what's happening here at the human level is not new to the African American community. They've learned over generations how to get through these difficult times. What I've seen is this is a moment of triage, right? This is a moment of acute threat. We need to get through this. We have to be clear about the threat we're facing domestically and globally. We need to get through this so that we can then renew, rebuild, and reimagine what a democracy looks like in this country. And if we spend a lot of time spinning wheels, I'll just be honest, and I'm hearing this from leaders abroad looking in, then we're not going to get anywhere. We need to get through this moment so we can get to the other side. But it's the clarity of what the risk is right now, clarity of what this country and the world will look like if we don't find a way together to get through, maintain, preserve, and renew this democracy, then we're all in deep trouble. Even thoughts of forgiveness for the trauma, violence, and loss will be more difficult because the pain and suffering and cost is just going to increase.
How has this work changed your life?
I don't think I could have done anything else. So a friend of mine says research is often me search. I'm not saying this is my me search. I just think this was my calling. I could have not done anything else starting in my 20s. It was always grounded on healing relationships and also healing this planet. And my curiosity over the years, I've met shamans and witch doctors and others in different parts of the world. And the healing they practice comes down from their elders and generations of what works, not some textbook they saw in an online class in terms of the ritual, right? And I think that's what we need to do too, is say, we often know, because a lot of the challenges that we talk about at this larger level, we experience in our daily lives and relationships. We find ways to navigate, and we know where there are difficulties. And we know it's very difficult to forget. There are family members where people have done horrible things. They'll never forgive them, but he's still my relative, or she is. And so I think grounded in that survival instinct, which is there at the core. The great Albie Sachs from South Africa, who survived multiple assassination attempts and lost an arm and an eye. I saw him 2 months ago, and he was nearly 90. And he said, we will get through this, but we have to be absolutely certain about what's at stake and what we're called to do at this moment.
What would you like to leave this audience with?
First of all, I want to thank you, Eileen, for the work you do around forgiveness, because it is so key. I would imagine that your audience are people who are interested in this issue of forgiveness and their own personal lives and at a national and global level. There are no easy pathways to forgiveness other than recognizing it's your choice as an individual, but also recognizing that those who make the choice to forgive finally do it for themselves. And there's more and more evidence scientifically that it releases them from the PTSD. Forgiveness is a skill, but it's also a tool for yourselves and the reconstruction of healthier lives. What is it doing for you and your family and your community and your sense of being in the place in the world? And then another part about understanding. The more we understand what it is to be human, and not just at this sort of metaphysical level, but that our brains, that we're all pretty much the same. We respond to the world in similar ways.
If people wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Through our website, www.beyondconflictint.org. There's an info email there, or in LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect. I enjoyed this conversation. I hope it was helpful and useful.
Tim, I can't thank you enough. Thank you for your wisdom and for your words. It's just been awesome.
I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you for joining us in listening to Political Forgiveness, Voices of Peace, where I hope you were inspired by the work of forgiveness in creating social change. If you know of anyone who would find this episode helpful, please share it. For more information on political forgiveness, please visit my website, drboris.com, where you can find all the resources mentioned in the podcast, as well as sign up for the newsletter with the latest information on political forgiveness.